Welcome to Classic Paranormal, where we bring you true stories of the weird, strange, and otherworldly from works of literature from the past that time forgot. Don't forget to hit the share button to help promote this podcast. In this 8th episode of the series, you will be entertained by Hamlin Garland's 40 Years of Psychic Research, first published in 1936. Chapter 22, On Neutral Territory. Despite the fact that I'd been given full opportunity to test Mrs. Crandon's powers in a room 12 miles from Lime Street and in the voluntary absence of her husband, I was not entirely armored against criticism. I wished to make another test in a room which the psychic and her friends had never entered. This will forestall all charges of complicity on your part, I wrote to Crandon, and also on the part of those who have shared in the Lime Street seances. Furthermore, the test would be more convincing if none of Mrs. Crandon's friends were in the circle. Crandon recognized the justice of this contention and readily agreed to all my requests except the last. He insisted that Captain Fife should be included in the circle. He urged Captain Fife because of his position as fingerprint expert for the naval station in Boston. He is essential if you wish to secure such evidence. This I granted, for I was intending to try for a left thumbprint. The more carefully I studied the history of Mrs. Crandon's mediumship, the more inclined I was to call her the bravest living psychic. So numerous and so severe had been the tests to which she had submitted. For 4 years, scores of critics had practiced the most painful methods of control upon her with intent to prove her guilty of deceit or of lending herself to deceit. With this controversy, I had no concern. This volume is a record of my personal experiences. I came to a study of Mrs. Crandon after nearly 40 years of study and experiment, as my readers are aware. I had tested most of the phases she exhibited, but others were new to me and most important as evidence. Among my fellow directors of the Psychical Society was a very distinguished specialist in nervous diseases, Dr. Frederick Peterson. He was a member of the Century Club, and we often met there at luncheon time. With no expectation that he would consent to act, I asked him to come on my committee and share my third sitting with Mrs. Crandon. Much to my surprise and pleasure, he consented, and I told him that one of my oldest friends, Joseph Edgar Chamberlain of the Boston Transcript, had offered his library as the neutral ground of my test seance. He knows nothing of the Crandons except what he has read, and is entirely skeptical of all spirit phenomena. He and his wife live alone in an apartment on Commonwealth Avenue and would like to share in our experiment. There will be only the Chamberlains, ourselves, and Captain Fife, the thumbprint expert, present. Admirable, said Peterson. Mrs. Peterson would like to go with us if you don't mind. Thus it happened that the test circle included only Mr. and Mrs. Chamberlain, Dr. and Mrs. Peterson, Captain Fife, and myself. This suited me well, for the smaller the circle, the closer our study, and the more valuable the resulting phenomena. On the day appointed, Dr. Peterson met me at the Copley Square Hotel late in the afternoon, and I took him to call upon Dr. Crandon, whom he had never met. We found Crandon in his handsome library, taking his ease after a busy day at the hospital. He was tired, but mentally alert, and made a most favorable impression on Dr. Peterson as well as upon me. He said, "I was just where you gentlemen are when in 1924 my wife began to develop her occult powers. The phenomena, increasing month by month in reality and variety, at last convinced me of their truth and of the personality of Walter, who claimed to be your brother. His knowledge and resource are astonishing. Each week he devises something new in our tests. He is, in a sense, our chief engineer." He then showed us a series of enlarged thumbprints and described how they were received. He indicated the points of similarity between them and a thumbprint which Walter declared was made while he was alive. I listened in silence. It was all too technical and too intricate for me to follow, and I suspect Peterson felt the same lack of information. After describing the room at Chamberlain's in which we were to sit, I explained to Crandon that Dr. Peterson was a member of my committee, and that the circle would be small. He was plainly relieved. "I shall deliver the psychic at Mr. Chamberlain's door at the hour named," he said. Just as we were about to leave, Mrs. Crandon came in, and we had a few moments' chat with her. She was a gay and charming figure, smartly gowned and graceful, the farthest removed from the conventionalized picture of a medium, and Dr. Peterson's gray face relaxed as he listened to her laughing remarks about the possibilities of the coming test. "Walter will do his best, I'm sure," she said. While walking away, Peterson said, "She seems entirely normal. Not in the least the kind of person I expected to meet." It was not easy to darken the Chamberlain library, which was large with several windows and doors. But we succeeded in doing so, and when Marjorie arrived, her chair was ready for her. At my request, Mrs. Chamberlain stitched the tape to the psychic's sleeves, and in my usual way I drew the double tape in her sleeves close to her wrists and nailed them to the arms of her chair with long tacks. In addition, I tied a second tape tightly around her wrists and nailed its two ends to the floor. The knots were in the middle of the tape. We then placed the library table at the center of the room, and at a little distance from it, we set a table at which the stenographer was to sit. A red lamp provided light for her task. Fife was on hand with his wax tablets, illuminated basket, and other tools for the carrying out of our experiment. I would have preferred to have Dr. Peterson at the psychic's right hand, but as I was in full control otherwise, I made no protest. I'm aware that all this is boresome repetition, but it is a necessary part of every report. I condense it to the point of saying I made it impossible for Mrs. Crandon to have any hand in what was to take place. Mrs. Chamberlain and Mrs. Peterson, who had not met the psychic and witnessed her disrobing, agreed that she brought nothing into the room. The official stenographer took her seat at her table, which was behind me and a little to my left. The small shaded red lamp she used remained alight throughout the sitting. Her notes in the report, which I wrote immediately after the seance, are the basis of this report. Almost immediately after the turning out of the lights, Walter announced himself by whistling merrily. He then greeted us all in a breezy, not to say rowdy style. As I had satisfied myself at a previous sitting that this voice did not issue from the lips of the psychic, I replied to it as a separate personality. Peterson and Chamberlain, I've no doubt, considered this merely ventriloquism on the part of the psychic. In this case, I could confirm that the sound did not come from the stenographer. She was not the culprit. It came rather from Dr. Fife's side of the table. If this voice was independent, as I believe it was, these first 4 minutes were worth all the trouble we made the Chamberlains. But I read disbelief in their wondering silence. Fife and I were in key positions and less concerned about their attitude. Walter's voice was quite as vigorous and much less guttural than at the former sitting. In fact, his utterance had all the variety and dramatic force of a distinct personality. For example, he said to me, "Mr. Garland, what can I do for you tonight?" And when I replied with a challenge in my tone, "I want a left thumbprint," he whistled as if in dismay. "You don't want much, do you?" he retorted. "No," I replied, "just a left thumbprint." He made some remark to the effect that he would see what he could do. I think he knew why I wanted a left thumbprint. I wanted to grasp the nailed and leashed and taped left wrist of the psychic while the impression was being made. Fife was at her right hand, and while I did not distrust his vigilance, I knew that my official report would have much more value if I received the print of a left-hand thumb. Conditions were in truth quite ideal. Crandon and Richardson were both eliminated. Aside from Fife, the members of the circle had my complete confidence and control. To meet all charges against the psychic, no sensational or spectacular phenomena were essential under these conditions. The slightest supernormal movement of an object on the table would exonerate her. Walter treated me almost as a member of the family. Notwithstanding my years, he addressed me as Garland, my boy, his tone indicating that he regarded me indeed as a regular feller. The stenographer's notes read, Walter then called for the basket in which were a score or more of letters cut out of wood. This basket was behind Garland, and at Walter's command, Garland reached back, caught the basket by its handle, and set it down under the edge of the table and near the psychic's feet. I had no notion of the number of the letters or of their character, and I made sure that they were out of reach of everyone but Fife. Walter then moved the basket, saying, "Hello, Garland, how are you tonight?" He then threw a letter out on the floor near Garland, saying, "This is an M." Garland picked it up and said, "I think it is a W." Walter then said, "Hold it up and I'll tell you." Garland held the letter up. It was so dark that no one could even see my arm, much less the difference between an M and a W. "You're right, my boy," said Walter. "It is a W." He threw out another letter on Fife's side, saying, "That is a Z." Fife examined it and said, "Z is right." 4 or 5 other letters and one number, 8, were thrown out of the basket and correctly named. I don't know what Chamberlain and Peterson thought, but my conviction at the moment was that these were not only genuine telekinetic phenomena, but clear-cut examples of perception in the dark. The psychic could not touch these letters with her hands, and to pick them out with her stockinged feet and correctly name them was not in the range of her normal powers. Trivial as this stunt may seem at first sight, it became enormously significant when linked up with my previous experiments. I must repeat and repeat that her wrists were bound with tape and nailed to her chair. Walter now said something about passing the contribution box, and immediately, the smaller illuminated basket rose in the air and moved about the table. Drop something into it, some object to be identified and returned later. This we all did. As the basket came to me, I dropped into it a poker chip, a most unlikely object to have in one's pocket, and a most difficult object to pick up with the stockinged foot. I then placed the basket under the table as before, some distance from the psychic's feet, and resumed control of her left hand. Again I quote the stenographer's report. Quote, "Walter is heard to move the basket. The first object identified and thrown on the table was a spectacle case belonging to Mrs. Chamberlain. The second, a bottle of pills, confirmed by Fife. The third, a pair of scissors in a little case, confirmed by Chamberlain. the fourth a poker chip belonging to Garland, end quote. Now all these articles would be difficult to lift out of the basket with one's toes, but my poker chip would be especially elusive. I regarded this as an admirable test. However, I was determined to push the experiment further. I said, "Walter, I'm going to stump you. I'm putting something into the basket which will try your powers." He replied jocosely, "Shoot." I dropped into the basket a minute object which no toe could possibly lift or define. A rustling of the basket followed, and for a few seconds Walter was silent as if feeling of the object. At last he said in a puzzled way, "It's a coin about the size of a Canadian 5-cent piece." Then after another pause he added, "It has a hole in it. Something like a Chinese coin." "Bravo, Walter," I called out. "You've almost got it. If you'll tell me what the hole in the middle of the coin means, you'll win a grand victory." After another pause he said, "It seems to have a couple of slits. I can't make it out." I then said to the other sitters, "The coin is a token such as the railway company in Washington uses. The rough place which Walter feels is the letter W cut out of the coin." In an injured tone, Walter asked, "How could you expect me to know that? I never was in Washington." A moment later, the coin was deftly dropped into my hand. The precision of this movement was in line with all the many similar observations I had made. There was no searching, no fumbling. It came to my invisible palm as though darkness did not exist for the agent. Will the doubter say that the psychic picked up the minute coin with her toe? I had in my pocket another small metal object still more difficult to handle and identify in the dark. With another jovial challenge to Walter, I dropped this object into the basket. This he at once fingered, to judge from the rustling sound, and presently threw it out on the floor, saying, "It resembles the bar on a wealth chain." "Fine," I exclaimed. "Now feel of the two ends and tell me what you find on them." "Laid in the dish on the table," he replied. A moment later, I felt it being pushed into my half-closed right hand. Having laid it in the dish, I resumed firm control of the psychic's wrist and waited. Walter then said, "One end is rough and the other smooth, and there is a groove in the middle of it." Again, I applauded him. "If you can tell me what is on the other end of the bar, it will be one of the finest tests ever made." He gave further attention to it, then said, "I give it up, it's too fine for me." I then explained to the circle that the object was a large-size printer's quad. One end was smooth, but on the other end, the Lord's Prayer was molded in microscopic form. On one side was a notch which Walter had called a groove. It was an astonishing feat of perception in the dark. To say that the psychic put that minute object into my hand is absurd. Again, I quote the stenographic notes, quote, "Fife then broke his control in order to pour some hot water into the dish which had been placed on the table in preparation for the making of fingerprints. Garland repeated his request for a left thumbprint, and Walter said, 'I will give you one.' The hot water was put in the dish with the cold water dish beside it. Walter asked Fife to break the piece of wax in half. This he did and resumed control of the psychic's right hand." End quote. A few moments later, I heard something drop into the dish, and Walter said, "Garland, put your hand in the cold water dish and take out the wax." This I did, placing the wax on the table near me. Fife then turned on the red light. The cloth was outside the dish and neatly folded. There was no wax in the hot water dish. It had been crushed into a wad, and on it I could see a roughly outlined thumbprint. Whether it was a left thumbprint or not, I cannot say, but it was nearly twice the size of the psychic's thumb. Fife declared it to be the right thumbprint and that it was Walter's. The psychic had no normal part in this stunt. The thumbprint may have been Fife's or Peterson's or Chamberlain's. It was not mine, and it was not Mrs. Crandon's. Furthermore, 2 hands must have been employed in removing the cloth and folding it. If it was a trick, the psychic must be counted out. At the request of Walter, I then moved the illuminated basket to the middle of the table. The lights were again turned out, and immediately the basket began to move. "Are all hands controlled?" I asked. All responded, "Yes." The basket then rose and swung in a circle above the table, performing some rather intricate movements. There was nothing in this which was new to me, but the character of the members of our small circle made these movements of great value. One of the playthings hitherto had been an illuminated perforated cardboard disc about 5 inches in diameter, which Walter had named the donut. Taking it from the basket, he passed it to me, saying, "Lay it on the table before you." This I did. He then took it up and flourished it above my head. This was out of Fife's reach. He then carried it down nearly to the floor and held it there at my right knee, a position impossible to Fife. From that point, it rose slowly and came toward my face. Afterward, I learned that Walter wished me to take it from his hand. Why did he not speak to me at the time, I cannot imagine. I did not think of this, for I was maintaining rigid control of the psychic's left wrist. The disc dropped to the floor near my feet. Picking it up with my right hand, I placed it on the table again. Walter then directed me to draw the disc closer to my side of the table. "Put your nose on it," he said. As I bent my head over the disc, I felt fingers touching my head. Somebody pulled a lock of my hair. Walter said, "I'm the guilty party." I then said, "Show me your hand above the donut." While gazing down at the disc, I plainly saw a large hand, a left hand, a clumsy black silhouette moving with a circular motion just above the faintly glowing disc. It was not the psychic's left hand, and I do not believe it was Fife's. I had seen and felt such hands several times before under test conditions, and I'm willing to call it phantasmal. I did not touch it, but it touched me. This practically ended the sitting, which must be called a success insofar as it eliminated Crandon and Richardson from the group of suspects. That it was more convincing to me than to Chamberlain or Peterson was natural, for I was closer to the psychic. In my judgment, it confirmed the reality of Mrs. Crandon's supernormal powers. As a further detail, I may add that to free her from her bonds at the close of the sitting, I was forced to use a tack hammer. I had driven the nails down through the doubled tape in the folds of her sleeve so deep into the chair arm that they had to be pried out. The handling and identification of the coin in the quad by Walter evidenced the most delicate perception, a perception which had the effect of seeing, but which must have been near to a sense of feeling. His hesitation in speech and the rustling of the basket would indicate that he was fingering the coin, feeling of it, puzzled by it. If the reader is disposed to accuse Fife of doing the trick, I must continue to state that certain of the movements of the disc were wholly beyond his reach. Such accusations will not do. Critics began by accusing Marjorie of fraud. Then they shifted the guilt upon her husband. Crandon being out of my circle, suspicion fell upon Richardson. Now here in this circle, Richardson was eliminated. Charges of fraud can lie only against me or Fife. This process is absurd. As Richet says, the moment you begin shifting the cry of fraud from the psychic to the sitters, you enter upon an endless chain of foolish evasions. Furthermore, this sitting was merely one of a long series of tests, many of which I have detailed in the foregoing pages. If it stood alone, it would be convincing, but it is only one of hundreds. All these phenomena, trivial in themselves, are important as telekinetic evidence. The hands which picked those small objects from the wastebasket and put the coin in my hand were not the psychic's. The hand which moved between my eyes and the illuminated disc was not hers. Her fingers did not pull my hair. The doubter is at liberty to say that I imagined it all or that somebody cheated me. As for Walter himself, I sensed him as an entity, but not as an entirely separate entity. He impressed me at all times as a personality which had grown out of a long series of similar sittings. Like Wilbur and Mitchell in the case of Mrs. Smiley and Katie King in the famous case of Florence Cook, Walter was a powerful, busy, slangy, and combative personality. But I could not entirely admit the claims of his friend. I am willing to grant that his voice was not normally produced by the psychic, and yet there was something in his tone which related him to her. Some of my readers may complain that all these happenings were stunts, and this is true. They had nothing to do with religious precepts or consolation. Like the spirits of many other sittings, Walter was definitely working to astound me by meeting my most difficult test. He brought no message from my beloved dead, and I did not ask him for such messages. In all that he did, he remained the shrewd and competent workman. I will go further and say that he was moved by a desire to prove the honesty of his sister's mediumship, and with this he succeeded without establishing his own identity. His chief disappointment, his only failure, was in the thumbprint, which was a right thumb, so Fife declared, and not very clear at that. At this time, so far as I knew, no left thumbprint had been secured. However, the psychic's right wrist was as securely nailed to her chair arm as her left wrist, and I asked the reader to recall that at previous sittings we got both right and left hands on a sheet of paper in the middle of the table. In short, we are concerned with Marjorie's supernormal physical phenomena as based in the realm of unexplored biology. If any one sort of phenomena in these two sittings under my control can be said to be more inexplicable than any other, I should instance those in which Walter whistled and sang while the medium was blowing into a tube which filled her mouth, and while I stood beside her watching her lips. In many previous tests, I had secured these voices in the light and in the middle of a horn while holding it in my own hands. I had conversed with these invisibles for hours at a time, and yet I had never before been able to convince myself that they were wholly independent of the psychic. Whence came this voice? How can a voice be produced out of thin air without tongue, teeth, lips, air passages, or lungs? How is it possible for these invisibles to whistle, sing, joke, chuckle, sigh, utter characteristic tones, all without tangible heads and diaphragms? The spiritualist is ready with his answer. They have bodies, the exact counterparts of their bodies while on this plane. Jolie declares, I saw the lips form while the whisper came. My mind is open to argument. I remain curious about the mechanism which produces these voices. My feeling at this sitting was that it all sprang from the medium in some extra-normal way, and I was deeply interested when Dr. Crandon told me that they had seen and photographed this ectoplasmic structure. In a more recent report, he writes of it in this way, quote, as the voice of Walter, the dead brother of Marjorie, was of the greatest value in our investigations, it became important to establish its reality. This we did, apparently, by mechanical means. We proved this voice to be independent of the normal use of the anatomy and physiology of the medium. But so far as we know, to form the words there must be developed a teleplasmic structure in some way similar to the human organism. To confirm this, we have many times seen and photographed a structure which Walter says the medium uses for the production of the human voice. There is almost no similarity, however, between this structure as we see it in the human voice-producing mechanism. It is a small mass, either gray or white in color, resembling in size and shape a potato. At times as we look at it, it seems to simulate a small face, much like the dried heads of the headhunters of the South Seas. From the small mouth of this potato-like face comes a structure like the human umbilical cord, from 1/4 to 1/2 an inch wide. It is twisted and from 8 to 12 inches long. This cord enters the right nostril of the psychic. We have many photographs of this structure, and our photographs confirm what our eyes see. This small head has been seen and its voice heard while several scientific investigators were permitted one by one to put a hand over the mouth of the medium." End quote. All this does not clear up the mystery. It is not possible for me to link the robust voice of Walter with a mouth and a small face no larger than a potato. In many dark seances, I have heard voices of booming sonorousness. Did they all come from a small mouth and an idioplastic structure no larger than my fist? Furthermore, these voices have individual characteristics. They resemble the voices of our dead. How can this be unless the lips, teeth, head, and air passages are similar to those of the man or woman we knew? Insoluble mystery, as a Frenchman would exclaim. All these mysteries are solved only by calling to our aid other still more insoluble mysteries. While writing this chapter, I have received Volume 3 of the Proceedings of the American Society for Psychical Research, in which I read that a conclusive test of the independence of the Walter voice has been made. I quote a paragraph and description of it. Quote, "We took a sensitive microphone similar to those used in radio broadcasting and placed it in a closed and sealed box which was mechanically, electrically, acoustically, and magnetically shielded from external physical influences. We then connected this microphone electrically with a loudspeaker located in a distant part of the building, all connections and equipment being likewise shielded from external influence." End quote. Notwithstanding all these precautions, Walter spoke through the microphone in a soundproof box. His voice was heard in a distant room, while not a sound could be heard by those who sat about the box in the seance chamber. Under these controlled conditions, there was no possibility that the microphone and loudspeaker could have been made to function by any normal means whatsoever. End quote. I am willing to grant that this application of laboratory methods of isolation demonstrates that Mrs. Crandon had no normal physical part in the production of the voice. My doubts begin when the identity of the speaker is declared. It remains to say that Walter, according to recent report, has been able to function in the absence of both Marjorie and her husband. He has been able to read cards held up in the darkness of the seance room and to move small objects. But thus far, he has not been able to speak to the circle while she is out of the room. Perhaps he may be able soon to overcome this inhibition, for he has been able to use the microphone in a locked box while his sister was in another part of the house. However, I do not hold myself responsible for anything beyond my personal test. As I have repeatedly said, this is a plain narrative of facts personally witnessed. My experiments must justify themselves. Chapter 23. A Group of Literary Ghosts. After these rigidly controlled sittings with Mrs. Crandon, I was less inclined than ever to sit with commonplace mediums in dark circles, no matter how intelligent and sincere they might appear to be. And for several years I encountered no other novel phases of mediumship. There is but one more advance for me to make, I told my friends, and that is to have the phenomena of my sittings with Mrs. Crandon, Mrs. Hartley, and Daniel Peters duplicated in my own library with no one present but the members of my family. And to this end I sought for a psychic willing to cooperate with me. In 1930, 3 years after my meeting with the Crandons, I found myself a resident of Los Angeles, in whose genial air all varieties of religious devotees find refuge. The city swarmed with clairvoyants, crystal gazers, seers, psychometrists, trumpet mediums, yogis, and astrologers. In such a welter of wonder workers, I had the hope of finding one or two who would be willing to lend themselves to my purpose. Alas, no such individual could be found, and I well understood the reason. Most of these practitioners of occult rites regarded their mysterious powers either as a means of grace or as an endowment to be used for the consolation of the bereaved. Some had made their gift a source of profit as preachers or as adepts. None of them were keenly interested in a scientific analysis of the nature and origin of their gifts, and I suspect that those who had joined the branch of the American Society for Psychical Research had done so in the belief that it was at bottom a spiritualistic body. I did not blame these practitioners then, and I do not blame them now. Why should a minister step down from his rostrum and submit his powers to the cold steel and electrochemical control of investigators? What would the materializing medium or the public psychometrist gain by meeting with a research committee? The martyrdom involved in a series of tests such as I'd repeatedly carried out with others was not alluring. I could not blame them. I should refuse if I were in their places. The seances in Los Angeles to which I was occasionally led opened with prayer and ended with the doxology, and were held in dark chambers. In no case were the psychics or sitters subject to control. Faith ruled, and the happenings were all of the good old sort. The voices, the caressing hands, the sound of bells, all the phenomena common since the Fox sisters were still taking place. These meetings were not only stereotyped, they were traditional. I do not accuse any of these mediums of deceit. I think they were sincere in considering their circles essentially devotional. They were consolers and healers. What had they to do with thumbprints and voice cutout machines? Several of them were elderly ladies who had been dispensing comfort in this way for half a long lifetime, and who were surrounded by clouds of witnesses, earlier devotees who, having themselves become spirits, now returned to augment the invisible ranks of supporters. Among these who held private seances, wholly without pay-in for their friends, was Delia Drake, an old acquaintance who by sitting devotedly and regularly for more than a year had developed definite mediumistic powers. Her phases, as reported to me, were feeble, consisting of the movement of a trumpet in the dark and raps on nearby objects. All very rudimentary. But in the belief that I could develop her into stronger phases, she consented to sit with me at my convenience. I consented to try her out. As she was an old friend, a woman whom my wife had known for 30 years, I could not ask her to submit to control, and so I must ask the reader to value the phenomena as I do on their amusing literary character. They offer so many curious and illogical happenings that I consider them worthy of record at this point. They are interesting from the human side. My diary fixes the date of our initial seance. Quote, January 22nd, 1933. We tested our psychic friend for 2 hours last night. The circle contained only my family. The windows were darkened and the lights turned off. The trumpet was about 2 feet in length and wore a band of luminous paint in order that we might follow its movements. After a tedious wait which we filled in by singing and telling stories, our psychic began to cough violently as if being strangled. Immediately after this attack, the horn rose and came to me. After tapping me on the arm as if in greeting, it faced me with an unwavering stare of its larger radiant end. It seemed to wait for me to speak. I asked, "Is it someone for me?" It waved up and down emphatically 3 times. "Yes." "Can't you speak and tell me who you are?" I asked. Without answering me, it went over to my wife, who said, "Is it someone I know?" A faint whisper came from it. "Yes." "Can't you give your name?" I could not hear the reply, but my wife and my daughter Isabel both caught the word Fuller, and my wife cried out, "Is it you, Henry B.?" In reply, the horn shook as if with joy and waved vigorously up and down in most emphatic affirmation. Going to my daughter, it tapped her gently on the arm, and then, as if exhausted, sank softly to the floor. A few moments later, it rose again and returned to my wife. Upon her request for the name of this operator, a whispering voice said, "I am Charles Francis." This was the name of her brother-in-law, a Chicago painter, Charles Francis Brown. At this moment, another fit of coughing seized the psychic, and the cone rising in the air addressed itself to Olive Grismer and began whispering messages broken by sobs, a singular effect. Mrs. Grismer heard the words plainly and at last said, "It is my sister who died some months ago in France." She was deeply affected by the message, which she declared was entirely evidential. I could not catch all the words, but I sensed the agony in the sobbing breath of the speaker. At various times during the sitting, movements of the pencil and paper could be heard, and I repeatedly urged Fuller to write his name. At the close of the sitting, I found this sentence clearly written: "Trust us to prove all life." Back to back with this line, a short sentence was written, but so illegibly and in such strange characters that it was absurd. It looked like "Root is here." That this sitting will have small value to the critical, I am fully aware. But as William Stead said, I had proved my ready reckoner so many times that I was ready to give our guest the benefit of the doubt. Assuming the attitude of the doubter, let us say, Your psychic could have manipulated both the horn and the pencil on the paper. They were all within her reach. This is true. She might have moved the cone and produced the whisper. But as she knew nothing concerning Mrs. Grismer's sister in France, her dramatization of a spirit suffering poignant remorse may be conceived as a case of mind reading. We all felt the emotion of this dialogue, and Mrs. Grismer was herself deeply moved by the truth of it. This sitting led me to say to our psychic friend, from this time on, I want you to sit in my study with no one in the circle but my immediate family. To this she readily consented, and I set about the preparation of my library, which is on the second floor and at the back of the house. No room could have been more favorable. It was quiet, separated from the telephone, and easily darkened. Placing a small unpainted table in one corner, I grouped 5 chairs about it and laid pencil and paper on its top. As soon as we were seated and the lights turned out, I said jocularly, addressing the invisible, "Fuller, I expect to have your signature on that sheet of paper." After a long wait, our psychic again began to cough as if choking, and immediately the trumpet rose and hovered over her head, and then came to each of us. This spirit announced herself as Barbara, the psychic's daughter. As the horn tapped me on the arm, I asked, "Is this Fuller?" A strong, clear, definite whisper came from it. "Yes." "Fine," I exclaimed. "I'm glad you're here. I want your full cooperation in this series of experiments." We then conversed for a few moments, quite as we used to do when he was in the flesh. The utterances from the trumpet were entirely in character, concise, humorous, keenly intellectual. I said, "Fuller, do you remember our sittings with Mrs. Hartley when we talked with McDowell and secured some of his music on closed slates?" To this he whispered, "Certainly I do." I went on, "I've just been going over your account of those sittings. How does my report read now?" "As well as ever. Now, Fuller, I don't want any Mahatmas or little bright eyes mixing in here. You and I took the purely scientific view in 1908, and I want to continue in that attitude. Let's make this series of sittings worthwhile." I asked the reader to bear in mind that while the room was almost perfectly dark, no outsider was present. The sitters were my wife, my daughter Isabel and her husband, and the psychic, who was my wife's personal friend and had nothing to gain and all to lose by playing jokes upon us. She was a serious elderly woman of religious type. I ended the sitting with a feeling that our psychic's case required still more careful analysis than I had been able to give it. The only writing on the table this time consisted of 2 words scrawled in the corner: "God rules." The absence of a capital letter is significant. Toward the close of our sitting, the table flopped over on its side, spilling my pencils and paper on the floor. I mention this for the reason that it led me to prepare against a similar roughhouse the next time. A week later, as we took our seats in the same place and in the same order, I said to Fuller, who had once announced himself, "You tipped the table over last week and spilled our pencils and paper so that we got no writing. To prevent this, I have fastened the sheets of paper to the table with thumbtacks and have tied the pencils to the tacks with dental floss." This seemed to amuse him. He chuckled softly. "That's like you," he whispered. "Always prepared." Now occurred one of those illogical manifestations which make for the honesty of our psychic. 2 invisibles whispered their names to my wife. One was an elderly woman, a relative by marriage. The other was her daughter, who spoke in a wistful, eager way, precisely as we remember her. Why should these 2 spirits come to my wife when she naturally expected her father and mother? The younger woman whispered as one deeply agitated, voicing a desire to send a message to her sister. She vanished, and Fuller came back. After tapping me on the shoulder, he spoke in a strong, full whisper, but I could not quite distinguish his words. I said, "I hear you plainly enough, Fuller, but your articulation is bad. Your words all run together." To this he replied with an effort to speak clearly, "Yes, that is our barrier. Articulation is difficult." I then said, "I have been reading a report by Gelli who suggests that the utterances of the invisibles is often made by means of an indrawn rather than by an outgoing breath, and that this accounts for their defective character." The invisible one seemed to ponder this for a moment. "There is something in that," he replied judicially. "I'll look into it." "Now, Fuller," I went on, "let's get down to fundamentals. How do you move that horn? Do you use your ectoplasmic hands?" To this he instantly replied, "Bands, not hands." I went on, "Here is a grand chance to experiment. You were in my study with only my family present. You should be able to present many novel phenomena." No reply came from the horn, but at the close of the sitting we found on the top sheet of paper this line, "Plan, and I will attempt to work it out satisfactorily." The word "plan" was underscored. The words were properly spaced, the I's exactly dotted and the T's crossed. The writing closely resembled Fuller's script. It chanced that this sitting came only a day or two after the Long Beach earthquake, and on the same sheet with Fuller's declaration were these words: "Bands of helpers were busy on this earth while your earth was shaking." At right angles with this and in Fuller's handwriting was a reply to a remark I had made to my family during the sitting. Quote, "He seemed to like Lilydale and Belle Mahoney." End quote. "I always enjoyed simple melodies," he wrote. "The question to be answered first is this: why should Fuller come to me rather than my father or my mother? Was it because our psychic knew Fuller and did not know my parents? Or was it because Fuller had more power, more skill? Why should a distant relative by marriage come to my wife rather than other and more intimate friends?" At our next sitting, in which only my wife and I took part, the room was not darkened completely. To make a dark cabinet, I spread over the low table a very large thick woolen blanket which trailed on the floor for a yard or more. On this robe I set the megaphone. We could see our psychic and the cone on the table, though dimly. My wife said, "The cone is outlined against the window," but I could see it only by reason of a pale cloud of mist which shimmered around its larger end, partially obscuring the band of radiant paint. In spite of these conditions, the cone rocked on its base without any visible hand touching it. And at the close of our sitting, we found under the horn and under the robe, on the sheet of paper tacked to the top of the table, these words written in large wavering lines: "The work progresses, difficult light." At our sitting on April 9th, I tried something new. I placed beneath the small table a portable typewriter, and after we were seated, I said, "Fuller, that machine on the floor is the one you used so often in the back room of our flat in New York City. I want you to write your name with it." No reply was spoken, but on one of the sheets of paper this message was written also in character. I had no idea that my going back to the typewriter would have value, but I will try it if you wish. My record reads, quote, "This was a most interesting sitting. Fuller, who had displaced the psychic's guide, her daughter, was in full control. He brought to me William James and John Burroughs. He said, 'We'll all leave our autographs this time.' James spoke to me with a great deal of feeling in a husky whisper. 'Garland, the world is ready for this philosophy. The great thinkers are going our way.' He then compared the mystical philosophy of Eddington, Jean, and Einstein with the materialistic tenets of the 90s. His hoarse whisper was almost a tone, but he spoke so rapidly and with such poor articulation that I could not distinguish some of his words. It was all in keeping with his thought and character. The content of the entire sitting was literary. Burroughs surprised me with the fervor of his utterance. He spoke in a rapid whisper with deep feeling. Fuller, on the other hand, was cool and nippy, wholly in character. On another sheet of paper were the promised autographs. The names Burroughs and James were in feeble small script running sideways to the medium's position, while the initials CFB and John CV were at the very top of the sheet and upside down. They stood for Charles Francis Brown and John C. Van Dyke. The entire sitting was taken up by a discussion by those invisibles of literary and philosophic subjects. Nothing but a stenographic report could set forth its lifelike character. The psychic coughed as if strangling at times, but for the most part remained quiet as if in a light trance. At the close of the sitting, she seemed dazed and physically inert. Her hands appeared swollen and heavy, and she did not recover her normal condition till after she had taken 2 strong cups of coffee. April 19th. The session tonight was again wholly literary, with Fuller as the dominant personality. One of the first whispers to come after we were settled was that of a spirit who gave his name as Bert, and when I asked Bert who, the answer came with painful effort. I could distinguish only Bert, Bert, repeated eagerly. Fuller then said, "It is a man whose quips in the Tribune used to amuse you. It is Bert Taylor." Here was another unexpected visitor. Why should Taylor come to me rather than Edward Wheeler or Carl Ackley, for whom we have called? Taylor was a friend, but not an intimate friend. Now came a strong whisper from an invisible who called himself TR, and when I asked, "Is it Theodore Roosevelt?" he replied vigorously, "Yes, yes, Roosevelt, Roosevelt." For several minutes I talked to him as if I believed him, although I could not imagine Theodore Roosevelt with his lips to that cone, breathing a message into my ears. At our next sitting, I said to Fuller, "Does our singing really help you?" In reply, he whispered, "Yes." And at the close of the sitting, on one sheet of paper and sidewise to the psychic, these words in scrawling script appeared: "Song opens windows." It was not in Fuller's writing, however. On the other sheet was a message in small, admirably formed script, properly dotted, crossed, and punctuated. "Garland, we will prove to you the things you already know. J.B." This I took to be a gentle slam at me by John Burroughs, who always addressed me as Garland, and who had listened to several of my talks on psychics. He considered me a believer. On the following night, true to his promise, Fuller came again to our sitting, in which only my wife and I took part. The power was weak. Fuller spoke, but I could not distinguish his words. His whisper had volume, but his utterances blurred into a kind of rumble. I understood him to say William James is present. I said, Henry, you used to visit us at West Salem, at Onteora, and in New York. I wish you could see us here in our new California home. Can you see us? Or rather, perceive us here? He did not reply to me through the cone, but at the close of our sitting, we found these words in his script. Quote, your eyes plus your thought of us give us experience, end quote. The last word was badly jumbled, but experience seems to be the meaning. There is something rather fine in this thought. Our eyes plus thought of our dead friends make us visible to them. In discussing the general subject of psychic manifestations during these sittings, I said to my wife, these phenomena, these miracles have always existed. All literature is filled with just such manifestations, but under various names. When I turned on the light, I found these words written, quote, the greatest of all proof is in the Bible, end quote. The word which I have interpreted as proof was so blurred that I could not quite be sure of its meaning. Proof will serve. The writing resembled that which had been signed James, and on the second sheet in the same hand was the signature William J. In talking to Fuller, I had said, I'm going east and will soon be at the Century Club among our old friends. He had made no vocal answer to this, but I had found a line on the second sheet of paper. I will meet you at the club. It was not signed, but it closely resembled Fuller's writing. The T's were precisely crossed, although the word club was rather sketchy. It was all legible, however. At this point, my sittings were interrupted by a trip to Chicago and New York, and my next record is dated July 24th, shortly after my return from the East. Only my wife and I, my daughter Isabel, her husband, and our psychic were present. The room was perfectly dark, and no control was in effect. Fuller came at once, and I had a great deal of natural and humorous talk with him. I said, Fuller, I am at work on the 4th volume of my literary log, and I am inclined to give a full chapter to you. To this he replied with characteristic humor, tread lightly. I spoke of my approaching lecture for the Psychical Society. I'm quoting from your report on our McDowell experience. He said, be careful. He then asked, how does my report read? I replied, as logical as ever. This seemed to please him. I then said, Fuller, now that my literary reminiscences are almost finished, I am going to take up my psychic record again. To this he replied promptly, a good idea, but let the incidents in the book spell out something. The trouble with your Shatter world was the lack of sequence. It was chronologically jumbled. This I admitted. I did that, as you know, for the editor of a popular magazine who wanted a series of after-dinner conversations. I shall make my new book a straight historical account of my experimentation in psychic progress. I am to address the Psychical Society here on Wednesday night, and I intend to lay all my cards on the table. His reply was characteristic. Don't forget the ace, he warningly whispered. Throughout the conversation, which was perfectly natural and unconstrained, his whisper became almost full tone. His replies were swift, whimsical, and to the point. His talk with my wife and daughter was also in character. To me, he said, we have great plans for you. We'll help you write that last chapter. At this moment, the power appeared to weaken, and we sang Loch Lomond in rapid time, purposely pounding out the rhythm on the theory that such vibrations warmed up the machine like a radio tube. When we had finished, Fuller asked with sarcastic intonation, what was that? I apologized for maltreating this fine old song. We thought the rhythm more important than the tune. He retorted, the rhythm is helpful, but you must also bear in mind the emotional part, the melody. At the close of the sitting, we found on the paper this sentence, quote, it is well enough to make study if in the end you reach the desired result, end quote. We had sung Home Sweet Home, and on the lower sheet of paper in a totally different hand I found these words, quote, home means more than ever here and now, end quote. This is significant. Does it mean that the spirit longs for his good old third-dimensional plane? Although these sittings have no scientific weight, they have indirect value by reason of the unexpected personalities who came into our circle. For example, one night a whisper issued from the cone, a faint and tired voice which said, I am Pierce. None of us were acquainted with anyone named Pierce, and I asked, what is your full name? To my amazement, the voice replied, Franklin Pierce. Not President Franklin Pierce. Yes. This was astounding. Why should Franklin Pierce come to our circle, I asked. My wife then dimly remembered hearing her mother say that Franklin Pierce was a distant relative. She spoke to Pierce, but he did not answer. Wholly illogical, he faded away and never came again. Another personality of especially vigorous action introduced himself as Lee Summers. Lee was our good friend when alive, but there was no special reason why he should come. Toward the end of the sitting, James said, "Garland, Henry never believed in this, and neither did Alice. Alice used to make fun of it and laughed at my credulity." My daughter asked, "Who was Alice, your wife?" "No, my sister," the invisible replied, and the horn sank slowly to the floor. I did not know that William James had a sister, but it is possible that our psychic did. I immediately wrote to James's daughter in San Francisco and confirmed the statement of the ghost. On this same night, a strong and pleasant voice spoke, and when I asked, "Who is it?" he replied, "I'm going to amuse you by saying that I don't know who I am." "You don't know who you are?" "Oh yes, I know who I am, but I can't remember my name." "Were you an author?" "No." "Were you an artist?" "No." "What did you do?" "I did what I'm doing now." He hesitated. "If I could only remember my town." My wife spoke up. "Was it Chicago?" "That's it," the whisper joyously exclaimed. "It was in Chicago. I was an architect in Chicago." "You were Pond?" I suggested. "That's right. I am Pond. A.B. Pond." He seemed overjoyed at being recognized, but did not ask for anything, did not say anything more. He too vanished and never came again. That our psychic was acquainted with Pond I knew, but his coming seemed illogical nevertheless. Chapter 24. Danger Signals. As the sittings went on, my wife became very much concerned over the very evident bad effect which they had upon the health of our mediumistic friend, who complained of sleeplessness after each seance. "I hear voices," she explained, "and I feel on my face something like cobwebs." Each sitting left her weaker and more apprehensive. Our sitting on August 14th was predominantly literary. My record reads in part, quote, "Fuller came. He handled the horns expertly and spoke almost in a full tone. His articulation was so bad, however, that I could scarcely follow him. But we held a most significant dialogue. During my visit to Chicago, I had learned of a very beautiful little book of notes and drawings which Fuller had made during his first tour of Italy, and the owner of this book, his niece, had asked me to find a purchaser for it. I now seized upon this volume as an identification test. "Fuller, what shall I do about that book of drawings?" He appeared puzzled. "What book of drawings?" I explained. At the close of my explanation, he said with characteristic depreciation, "Those drawings have no value." He then said, "You will be surprised when you learn who was here." At this moment, for no reason at all, a vision of John Sargent came into my mind, although I had not thought of him for many months. "Is it Sargent?" I asked. The cone rapped a vigorous yes. "Will you write your name?" Again the tap spelled yes. Fuller then said, "Burroughs is here also." I said, "I wish you would bring Dr. Turk." Fuller chuckled. "You'd have to convince him first." This reply was especially pertinent, for Dr. Turk, my most devoted friend as well as my physician, detested the word psychic and considered my experiments foolish. At this point, the pencil could be heard busily at work, and I remarked, "That may be Sargent. Perhaps he'll leave a drawing." A clear voice greeted us. "This is Doyle. I want to introduce a young man." His name was not given, and no reason for his presence was offered. He seemed a casual companion, one who just came along. I said to Fuller, "Did you miss our sittings while I was away? Were you lonely? Have you a sense of time?" He replied clearly, "We have a sense of the continuity of events, but not of time divided into periods." In reply to a question by my wife, he replied with highly characteristic depreciation, "As for me, I just let things slide." A little later, in reference to my skeptical attitude, he remarked, "You should listen to what they say over here about your claim that we are only a projection of the medium." He again said, "You will be surprised by the friend who has just put his name on the paper." At the close of the sittings, I discovered that the signatures Sargent and Burroughs had been telescoped like this, John S. Burroughs, as though my simultaneous thought had fused them. My surprise was contained in this message written in large script. Quote, "Another body cast off, a new life of renewed fight begun, Walt Whitman," end quote, which would be something more than surprising if I could believe it. August 23rd. Our sitting tonight was still more puzzling. Fuller came in strong. He said to me, "Did you ever see a face in the end of a trumpet?" I answered, "No, I never thought of it." He said, "I shall soon show my face to you." He urged us to ask questions. He said to me, "You will soon be able to call the roll of your literary friends, and they will answer." I said, "How many are here tonight?" He replied, many more than I can count. At the close of the sitting, we found several characteristic signatures of my friend. August 29th. Early in the sitting, the cone tapped me on the back of my hand, and when I asked, "Is it fuller?" he replied in full tone, "Yes." He was in philosophical mood, and we had much talk of modern science. He said, "Time and space do not exist for us." I then said, "I can't follow that, Fuller. I can't conceive of a personality without placing it in space. Our modern philosophers say time is the fourth dimension. What is the fourth dimension to you?" His reply was instant. "It is the plane just beyond your three-dimensional plane." I've thought of that. I've often had the concept that when you invisibles manifest to us, you come from a fourth dimensional region, and when you disappear, you re-enter it. Is that true? Are you living on the fourth dimensional plane? He again chuckled. "Yes, I'm not quite worthy of the fifth or sixth dimension." I don't understand that. I can't even grasp the concept of a fourth dimension. His answer was a stunner. "What would a two-dimensional man make of a cube?" In other words, I pursued, if I were walking with you when you wished to disappear, you would merely step up into the fourth dimension? "You can explain it that way," he jocosely replied. He then spoke at some length on the nature of force. "The energy which lifts the cone or cracks an atom is all the same." The spirit of Charles Francis Brown, my painter brother-in-law, now took the horn and demanded in his well-remembered argumentative tone, "Do you know what is going on at this moment on your earth?" "What do you mean, in politics?" "Yes." He then entered upon an eloquent harangue about economic changes and social growths, exactly as he used to argue while on Earth. He closed by saying jovially, "What are you waiting for, Hamlin? Come on over. It's a great lark. It's like getting on a train with a lot of your friends, flags flying, whistles blowing, and a great trip ahead of you. I tell you, it's grand." When he ran down and the horn dropped, a new hand lifted it, and someone whispered, "Garland." "Is it Burroughs?" I asked. His answer was dryly humorous. "And yet they say we can't put our personalities across." Another invisible now intervened. "Who am I?" it demanded as if to prove Burroughs' point. I named 2 or 3 of my friends, and at last the visitor laughingly said, "You are playing a guessing game. This is Doyle." After some remarks of no great importance, he turned the horn back to Burroughs, who spoke rapidly, almost gaily, on some very abstruse points in modern philosophical theories. In fact, the whole evening ran to political, social, and philosophical expositions. Just such a talk as my daughter had often listened to in our New York home. Our psychic appeared to be in a trance the latter part of the sitting, and when we turned on the faint red light, she lay inertly extended in her chair. Her hands were heavy and cold, and her face fevered and swollen. She came slowly back to life. "I heard almost nothing this time," she declared. On the top sheet of paper we found these words, quote, "A world movement begins to show itself in America. The power behind the man in Washington is the power behind the universe. Man begins to be man. Godspeed. Burroughs." End quote. This message, which resembled Burroughs' script in some degree, was dotted and crossed and punctuated with precision. It grew smaller and sadly confused toward the end, and the signature was quite feeble. That it came from Burroughs I could not believe. Godspeed did not sound like him. On the second sheet appeared the initials WW, the first W being smaller than the second. I took this to mean Walt Whitman, although no message accompanied it. The sitting which followed on September 7th was in many ways the most remarkable of all our experiences thus far. First, Barbara came, but gave way to Fuller, who was in better voice than ever before. His utterances were quite clear. He was followed by someone who spoke in a loud whisper. Again I guessed right by saying, "It is Burroughs." I then asked, "Is TR present?" "Yes, he is here, but much discouraged by his failure to reach his wife and sons." "Can he speak to me?" "He will try." A moment later, our smaller unlighted parchment cone tapped me gently on the back of my hand, and when I asked, "Is it Roosevelt?" it tapped out, "Yes." My daughter then said, "Shall we send a message to your wife?" No, was the instant reply. "She would not receive it. She thinks of me as somewhere, but she can't believe that I am near her." There was nothing characteristic of Roosevelt in this reply. I could not imagine him hesitant or discouraged on any plane. At my suggestion, my daughter and her husband then sang "Onward, Christian Soldiers," which was Roosevelt's favorite hymn. Later, on the top sheet of paper, we found these words, quote, "You sang our campaign song, 1912. Great times, but these are greater. I stand behind my cousin, TR." End quote. The metal cone now began to rattle and dance upon the table, and something in its action led me to say, "That sounds as it did when Lee Summers came." This caused the cone to beat upon the table so vigorously that it came apart, and the 3 sections rolled on the floor, one under the table, the other 2 under my daughter's chair. My daughter then said, "You did that, Uncle Lee. Now let's have a test of your powers as an engineer. You put it together again." In the darkness, we heard the pieces moving slowly towards each other across the floor, and a second later we caught the rattle and squeak as the horn reassembled itself, and the 3 sections were twisted into one another. A moment later, it rose triumphantly in the air, and a clear voice said, "There, I brought science to bear upon it." I said, "Lee, you and I often used to discuss this subject." He replied soberly, "Yes, I believed in it more deeply than you did. You considered me a little soft on that side of my brain." September 17th. I brought up the 4th dimension again tonight. I said to Burroughs and Fuller, "These sittings are absurd. I can't believe that you and James and Doyle are scrabbling around on the floor of my study, whispering to me through a tin horn." This brought a lively blast from Burroughs, who indignantly said, "We are not scrabbling on your floor." "Well, that's what it seems like to me," I persisted. "Unless you are operating on a plane where no floor exists, that's precisely what you are doing. The whole performance is ridiculous, and I am unable to take it seriously. It is all mystifying, but silly." James now took the horn and argued for the 4th dimension and the logic of his presence in my study. I could not catch all his words clearly and hence could not follow his argument. When he had finished, I replied, "I just can't believe that James and Whitman and Roosevelt or any other of my friends are here speaking and writing for the edification of my family. I'd like to believe it, but I can't." Fuller alluded to the birthday dinner which had been arranged for me by Gaylord Beeman at the University Club. "It was a grand event. I wanted to be there, but I didn't succeed. Many of your friends are now here offering congratulations." "Will they speak?" "No, but they will write their greetings." Later he said, 3 have written, but 30 wanted to write." Soon after he finished speaking, I felt a light tapping on my hand. It was the unlighted cone. I sensed a new visitor. After several guesses, something prompted me to ask, "Is it Father?" Instantly, the cone rapped me on my knee. I said aloud, "This is the first time any message has come over from my father. In all my sittings, neither he nor my mother has ever manifested." "Can you speak to me?" I asked. The cone feebly tapped, "No," and sank slowly to the floor. After a moment's silence, it rose again and with timid, caressing action crept across my knee and tapped me gently on the breast. When I asked, "Is this Mother?" it rocked gently on my knee. Rising slowly, it rested entirely on my arm for a minute or 2, then softly went away. End quote. Up to this sitting, my longtime beloved friend Hals had not made his presence known, although I had repeatedly asked for him. At our next meeting, the night of October 5th, a whispered greeting came to me. "I am Hals." The invisible then spoke at some length concerning his study of Swedenborg, which neither the psychic nor the members of my family regarded as characteristic of the great novelist. But I understood fully when he said, "My study of Swedenborg was a good preparation for the spirit life." He appeared passionately eager to clear away my doubts, but his long harangue only added to my doubts. His explosive utterances were wholly unlike Howell's, whose speech was always gracefully restrained. His reference to Swedenborg was evidential, but his manner of speech and his sprawling initials, WDH, which appeared on the sheet of paper, were not. Howells wrote a very fine, firm hand, and his initials were in keeping. I set this dialogue down for its singular mixture of truth and error. James, who followed, opened with a rapid-fire dissertation which I could not follow by reason of his failure to articulate. In his attempt to explain the conditions which surrounded him, he said, "Can a fish explain how he breathes and swims?" "No," I replied, "and neither can a Hottentot understand skating on ice." Fuller attempted to explain to my daughter the 4th dimension. He said, "You used to play cat's cradle with your father when you were little, didn't you? Well, now put your hands in that position." She said, "I have done so." After a pause, he began to chuckle. "It's no use. I can't do it. Howells and James are amused at my attempting to explain the 4th dimension to you." On the upper sheet of the paper I had tacked to the table appeared the signature, William Von Moody, exact in every stroke. None of us had mentioned Moody, and I had not thought of him since writing of him 2 years before. He gave no message, just signed his name. It was exact enough to pass scrutiny at a bank. The effect of this seance on our psychic was alarming. She complained next morning of being unable to sleep. but was eager to go on, although my wife was disposed to forbid it. 10 days later, we sat again in the same place with the same group. Fuller came as usual and acted as master of ceremonies. William James also spoke. Then, as before, the parchment cone came softly over to me and nestled on my arm, giving me the impression of a timid and tender visitor. I asked, "Is it Mother?" Again it tapped out assent. I then said, "Go to Isabel and speak to her. She hears better than I." The horn rose slowly and hung close to my daughter's face. It seemed trying to speak. I urged it on. "Say, Isabel." At last it whispered the one word, "Isabel." And when I said, "I heard you," a gentle sobbing followed as if the spirit were crying for joy at being heard. To the circle I said, if I could believe in that whisper, I would regard this as the most significant event of my life. Her whisper of a single word would mean more to me than all of Milliken's discourses or the cosmic ray. James returned and continued his discussion of the fourth dimension. He said, "We use many words in order to project our personality to you." I took this to be an apology for taking so much of the medium's strength. He added, "We could be much more concise, but such saving of words would not be characteristic, and our personalities as speakers would fail to manifest." On the sheet of paper at the close of this sitting was a single message, quote, "When I sang of the body triumphant, I referred to spirit. I speak of the body of thought, Walt Whitman," end quote. Altogether, this was one of the most perplexing of our experiences, but it proved disastrous to our psychic. She rose next morning feeling, she said, very weak and dizzy. She looked sick. Her face was swollen and her eyes bloodshot. Shortly after her breakfast, as she was standing in my wife's chamber, she slipped to the floor in a most terrifying cataleptic seizure. Fortunately, a trained nurse who was treating my wife caught her, and when I reached the room, she and my daughter had lifted the unconscious woman to the bed. She was rigid as stone and unable to speak. She looked like a dying woman. While not as alarmed as my wife and daughter, I realized that this was the end of our seances. Plainly, I could not ask this woman, a friend of my family, to go on sacrificing her health, not even to prove the return of the dead. She recovered in a few hours, but some weeks later she went east to spend the winter with her daughter. "I shall not sit again until I fully recover," she declared as she said goodbye. My final remark to her was intended to be jocose. Fuller and Burroughs and James will be eagerly waiting your return. There is a puzzling sequel to the Walt Whitman message quoted above. Several weeks after our friend's departure, I chanced to take up from my desk a small scratch pad, and while idly thumbing its leaves, I caught sight of some writing on a leaf in the middle of the pad. Recognizing it at once as spirit writing similar to that which came on the paper during the sittings, I turned the pages carefully, finding these lines. Quote, "Sing of the body triumphant, sing of the spirit electric. Too long has earth's note been sordid, so long has flesh claimed the power." Here 2 blank pages intervened. "Sing the spirit electric." 2 more blank pages. "Walt Whitman." End quote. Evidently, this message, written without my knowledge or that of the psychic, was part of the message which had appeared on the sheet of paper pinned to the table. Whether the pad was in my desk drawer or lying on the corner between my daughter's shoulder and my own, I cannot say. I set it down for what it is worth to the reader. In summing up the evidence of these sittings, I am unable to account for the dominance of Fuller, the marvelous duplication of his signature and those of John Burroughs, William Vaughn Moody, and Van Dyke. The writing beneath the blanket and the message from the woman who died in France are evidential. At a later date, I secured, with this same psychic, writing on a slate in the light. The signatures William James and HBF were written in bright pigment. While her hands were on top of the table, a pale bluish light filled the hollows of her palms. These slate writing experiments were less destructive of her health, but they disturbed her. And at last my wife forbade even these trials. In closing this chapter, I ask the reader's attention to the fact that none of the customary spirit messages from Red Thunder or White Fawn wasted our time. Our circles were almost entirely literary. Most of the spirits claimed to be my personal friends. Burroughs, James, Doyle, Howells, Roosevelt, Van Dyke, Whitman, Moody, Sargent, and several others, with Fuller as master of ceremonies. It is worthy of remark that none of my visiting authors were women. It would seem that I was the dominant factor in every performance. That my daughter possessed some supernatural power was evident, for I felt mysterious touches on the knee next to her, and she remarked that her legs were often cold and numb during the latter part of each sitting. Whatever the scientific shortcomings of this chapter, I am of the belief that it will not be skipped. You've been listening to Classic Paranormal's reading of 40 Years of Psychic Research by Hamlin Garland. This was the 8th installment. Be sure to click into the succeeding episodes until the book is complete. Until then, followers of the freaky, aficionados of the afterworldly, connoisseurs of the creepy, stay spooky. Before you go, consider subscribing to my new podcast, Classic Paranormal. It's a clearinghouse for lost real-life accounts of true ghost stories. It's found on Apple Podcasts. Go there now if you're interested in enigmatic tales, chilling true accounts, chronicles from cases of the past that time has forgotten, but that the modern person who likes relaxing by a campfire swapping ghost stories might appreciate. As I said, the new podcast I'm launching is available on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and there's a link in the description below on this video.